Judge Elaine Turner had built a reputation over her many years in the judicial system. She was known for her unwavering dedication to justice, her strict adherence to the law, and her calm demeanor in the courtroom. For Elaine, every case was a challenge to ensure fairness and uphold the law, and she took her job with the utmost seriousness. She had worked her way up from humble beginnings, putting in long hours of study and proving herself through tough cases. Her colleagues often admired her for her intelligence and professionalism, but few truly knew her on a personal level. In her private life, Elaine was a woman of routine. She didn't have time for romantic relationships, and her focus was always on her work. She spent her evenings reviewing case files, preparing her next set of rulings, and making sure her judgments were beyond reproach. Elaine had little interest in the distractions of relationships, and though friends and family sometimes expressed concern over her solitary existence, she simply brushed them off. Her career was everything to her, and she had no need for anything else. But everything changed when Michael Lawson was brought before her in court. The case was straightforward. He was accused of breaking and entering at the home of a wealthy businessman. Michael had a long history of criminal activity, ranging from petty thefts to more serious offenses. He was known for his ability to slip through the cracks, charming those who crossed his path and often avoiding significant consequences for his actions. But this time, the evidence was damning. It seemed like an open and shut case. Elaine's first impression of Michael was one of indifference. She had seen countless criminals pass through her courtroom over the years, and Michael didn't stand out as anything extraordinary. He was just another defendant, just another case to be dealt with in the pursuit of justice. Yet, as the trial began, something unusual happened. Michael's demeanor was unlike most criminals she had encountered. While others might be nervous, sullen, or defiant, Michael was calm, even charismatic. He held her gaze more than once, with an intensity that made her uneasy. There was a certain magnetism in his eyes, a sharpness that suggested he was used to manipulating situations to his advantage. Elaine focused on the facts of the case, determined not to let his charm distract her. But she couldn't help noticing how his presence in the courtroom seemed to affect the atmosphere. There was an undeniable air of confidence around him, and despite his criminal history, it was hard to deny that he was well-spoken, intelligent, and even likable in a strange, unsettling way. During the trial, as his lawyer presented his case, Elaine couldn't shake the thought that Michael wasn't just a criminal on trial. He was playing a game that involved more than just the law. As the days of the trial passed, Elaine found herself thinking about Michael more often than she cared to admit. She told herself it was nothing, just a passing interest sparked by the unusual nature of the case. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Michael's presence was starting to haunt her thoughts, and she wasn't sure if it was his charisma or something deeper, something darker, that was drawing her in. Elaine was a professional, but this was uncharted territory for her. She had never been so captivated by a defendant before, and she had no idea how to deal with the feelings that were growing inside her. As the trial dragged on, Elaine found herself becoming more aware of Michael. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting thought here and there as she reviewed case files or sat at her desk. But over time, those moments became more frequent. His face lingered in her mind long after she had left the courtroom. She told herself it was nothing, that it was just the weight of the case and the unusual confidence Michael seemed to exude. But the more she thought about it, the harder it became to dismiss him as just another defendant. He wasn't like the others. There was something about him that was different. Something that intrigued her in a way she hadn't experienced before. It wasn't long before Michael took the next step. One evening, after the court session had ended for the day, Elaine's phone rang. She had been reviewing notes on the case when the number flashed on her screen. Michael's name. Her stomach tightened, a feeling she couldn't quite explain, but she answered nonetheless. His voice was smooth, almost too calm as he spoke to her, his words deliberate. He thanked her for the fairness of the trial and praised her intellect. But he also claimed that he had information that could turn the case in his favor, something important she needed to know, but only in private. The request was unexpected, and at first Elaine felt uncomfortable with the idea of meeting him outside the courtroom, but something in his tone made her hesitate. There was a certain vulnerability in his voice that piqued her curiosity. She agreed to meet him, though she was cautious and guarded. They arranged to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a neutral place, away from the courthouse and the prying eyes of colleagues and media. When she arrived, Michael was already there, seated at a corner table. His casual attire contrasted sharply with the usual suits he wore in the courtroom. His relaxed demeanor seemed out of place for a man facing serious charges, but there was an ease about him that made the situation feel oddly comfortable. He rose to greet her with a warm smile, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, though it was hard to pinpoint why it seemed so disingenuous. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Michael seemed content to let the silence stretch, letting it hang in the air as if it were part of the unspoken tension between them. Elaine, unsure of where this meeting was headed, took a cautious sip from her cup, trying to regain her professional composure. He didn't immediately dive into the details of his case, as she had expected. Instead, he began to speak about something else. His life, his past, the hardships he'd endured. It was a strange conversation, not one she had anticipated, but somehow it felt more personal than any discussion of legal strategy. As he spoke, Elaine found herself listening intently, drawn to the way he described his struggles. How he had never been given a chance, how the system had failed him, how he had been shaped by his circumstances. There was a rawness to his words that she hadn't expected, a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. For a moment, she wondered if there was more to Michael than the hardened criminal she had seen in court. Maybe he wasn't just a thief, a liar. Maybe he was a victim of the very system he had come to distrust. Elaine pushed those thoughts aside, reminding herself that her job was to uphold the law, to separate her personal feelings from the facts. But as the conversation continued, she couldn't deny that there was something magnetic about him. His charm was undeniable. She found herself laughing at his jokes, even though she knew she shouldn't. They spoke for hours, and before long, she realized how much time had passed. As she stood to leave, Michael reached out and lightly touched her arm. "I'm glad we could talk, Judge," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "You're different from the others. You actually listen." Elaine wasn't sure what she felt at that moment, but it was a strange mixture of excitement and unease. She had crossed a line, and deep down she knew it. This wasn't just about the case anymore. Something else had been ignited between them, something dangerous. She left the cafe that night, her thoughts swirling with confusion. She tried to convince herself it was just a one-time meeting, that it meant nothing. But as she lay in bed that night, her mind kept returning to Michael's eyes, the way he spoke, the way he made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. She had met him as a judge, but somehow he had made her feel more like a woman, vulnerable, open, and alive, and that was exactly what scared her the most. Over the following weeks, Elaine found herself struggling with her growing connection to Michael. Despite her professional obligations and the weight of the trial she was overseeing, he lingered in her thoughts constantly. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that her fascination with him was nothing more than the result of an intense case. After all, it was her job to remain objective, to focus on the law, not personal feelings. But every time they crossed paths in the courtroom or when his name appeared in her case files, she felt a pull she couldn't ignore. Their meetings continued, each one more charged than the last. At first, they were brief encounters under the pretense of discussing the case. Michael would often stop by her office, offering new information or suggesting ideas that might help his defense. The discussions were professional at first, but slowly they began to stray away from legal matters. They started talking about their personal lives, about things they'd never shared with anyone else. Michael's stories about his difficult upbringing, his troubled past, began to resonate with Elaine in a way that she hadn't expected. She'd always been driven, always pushed herself to succeed. But in the quiet moments, when she listened to Michael, she realized how little she had allowed herself to connect with others. Her life had been consumed by work. She hadn't given herself the space for relationships, for emotional vulnerability. Michael, in his own twisted way, seemed to show her that. His honesty, however raw and self-serving, made her question her own choices. She had always prided herself on being in control, of keeping her emotions in check, but with him she felt something different. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't just a judge or a professional. She was a woman with emotions, desires, and vulnerabilities. Their physical proximity, at first incidental, soon became intentional. The brushes of their hands during a meeting, the moments when their gazes lingered a little too long, everything about their interactions started to shift. The lines between professional and personal blurred in ways she couldn't quite understand. Elaine tried to pull back, telling herself she was crossing a dangerous line, but every time she saw him, every time he smiled that sly grin, it became harder to resist. The attraction between them was undeniable, and despite her better judgment, she found herself craving more. One night, Michael invited her to dinner. The invitation seemed innocent enough, just a meal to discuss the case in a more relaxed setting. But the moment they sat down at a dimly lit restaurant, Elaine felt the tension building. Their conversation was still about the trial at first, but the subject quickly shifted to more personal matters. Michael leaned in closer, his voice soft and alluring, as if he was sharing a secret. He told her that he trusted her more than anyone, that she was the only one who had ever truly listened to him. The way he said it with such sincerity made Elaine's heart race. She knew it was all part of his game, but it felt so real in the moment. The evening stretched on, and soon the distance between them shrank even further. What had started as a casual dinner ended with them walking through the quiet streets, their steps in sync. Without thinking, Elaine found herself letting him guide her to his car, the promise of something more hanging between them like a heavy cloud. When they arrived at his apartment, Michael invited her in, and for a moment, Elaine hesitated. This was a line she knew she should not cross. Yet the temptation was too strong, the connection between them too intense to ignore. Inside, the atmosphere shifted once more. The conversation slowed, and the air grew thick with tension. There was no denying the attraction between them anymore. They both knew what was coming, but neither spoke it aloud. The evening ended with a kiss, gentle at first, tentative, but quickly escalating as if their years of restraint had finally broken free. What began as a simple touch of lips quickly spiraled into something neither of them could stop. Elaine left his apartment hours later, her thoughts in disarray. She knew she had crossed a line that could never be undone. The rational part of her mind screamed at her for being foolish, for allowing herself to fall for someone like Michael. But her heart told her a different story. For the first time in years, she had felt something raw, something unfiltered, and she couldn't deny that part of her wanted more. But as she walked back to her car, the reality of the situation hit her like a cold wave. She had just become entangled in something far more dangerous than a simple affair. She was tied to a man whose dark past was only the beginning, and in her pursuit of something real, she had unknowingly stepped into a world of lies, manipulation, and deadly consequences. Elaine's world began to unravel in ways she hadn't expected. What had started as a seemingly innocent affair with Michael quickly turned into something much darker. Each day she felt herself being pulled deeper into a web of deception, one she couldn't untangle no matter how hard she tried. Michael, once charming and elusive, had become an ever-present force in her life, his influence over her growing stronger with every passing encounter. Their secret meetings became more frequent, each one taking them further into dangerous territory. Elaine tried to maintain control, to remember who she was, but with each stolen moment she lost a little more of herself. The pressures of the trial, which had once consumed her mind, now seemed trivial in comparison to the chaos that had taken root in her personal life. She knew she was risking everything, her career, her reputation, her very sense of self. But despite her attempts to distance herself from Michael, she found it nearly impossible to escape the pull of their bond. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and she couldn't resist the way he made her feel alive, desired, and seen. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, and it was one she couldn't ignore. But with every step forward, Elaine became more aware of the dangers surrounding Michael. His past, once a distant memory in her mind, now seemed to lurk closer and closer, casting a shadow over their relationship. The man she had fallen for, intelligent, confident, and captivating, was also the same man whose criminal history had brought him to her courtroom in the first place. His charm had initially concealed the darkness lurking within him, but the cracks were beginning to show. Elaine began hearing whispers around the courthouse. Her colleagues were noticing her behavior changing, how she seemed distracted, distant, and at times visibly shaken. They were concerned, but she brushed off their questions, convincing herself that she could handle it. But the truth was, she wasn't handling it at all. She was losing control. The once sanguine foundation of her career was starting to crumble under the weight of her decisions. And deep down, she knew that if anyone discovered the truth, it would all come crashing down. Then, the news broke. A high-profile murder had occurred in the city, the brutal killing of a wealthy businessman, someone Michael had known well. At first, the police had no leads, no suspects, and the case seemed to be at a standstill. But then, a tip surfaced. Michael's name was linked to the crime. Elaine tried to dismiss it, tried to convince herself that it couldn't be true, but the evidence was mounting. She felt sick to her stomach, her mind racing as the pieces began to fall into place. The man she had fallen for, who she had allowed into her life, into her heart, was involved in something far darker than she had ever imagined. The police questioned Michael, but, as usual, he managed to evade suspicion. His charm and quick thinking allowed him to sidestep the investigators, leaving them with little to go on. But for Elaine, the reality was much harder to ignore. She couldn't escape the sinking feeling in her gut, the feeling that she was somehow complicit in his actions. She had allowed herself to become entangled in his world, and now there was no way out. Her nights were consumed with thoughts of Michael, the way he had lied to her, the way he had manipulated her emotions, the way he had drawn her into his web. She hated herself for being so blind, for letting her emotions cloud her judgment, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel conflicted. She had seen a side of him that no one else had, a vulnerability that made her believe in him, even when everything around her suggested she shouldn't. One evening, after a particularly intense argument with her colleagues over the case, Elaine found herself alone in her office, staring at the pile of case files in front of her. Her hands trembled as she sifted through them, her thoughts consumed by the weight of her actions. She could feel her world spinning out of control, each decision taking her further down a path she couldn't reverse. And then, just as the room seemed to close in around her, Michael's name appeared on her phone again. He had a message for her, something urgent. She knew she shouldn't respond, that every part of her needed to walk away from him, but she couldn't. She didn't have the strength to sever the connection that had formed between them, no matter how dangerous it was. The text read, "We need to talk. This is bigger than you think." Elaine's heart raced as she stared at the message. She didn't want to meet him, didn't want to fall further into the abyss he had created, but her curiosity, and a part of her she couldn't control, drove her to reply. She knew this conversation would change everything. Whatever Michael had planned, it would be the final step in their dangerous game, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what would come next. But she also knew that there was no turning back now. Elaine arrived at the place Michael had instructed her to meet him, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building loomed in the distance, its broken windows casting long shadows in the fading light of dusk. As she stepped out of her car, the cold wind bit at her skin, and a wave of unease settled in her stomach. She had been here before, meeting Michael in private, but this time felt the air was thick with tension, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. She walked cautiously toward the entrance, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty street. The dim light from a flickering street lamp illuminated the cracked pavement, casting eerie shadows along the way. When she reached the door, it creaked open before she could touch it, and Michael's familiar figure appeared in the doorway. He didn't smile this time. Instead, his face was serious, his eyes darkened with something unreadable. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside to let her in. Elaine hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She stepped inside, the musty air of the warehouse heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. The place was mostly empty, save for a few crates stacked in the corners and the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance. As the door closed behind her, Michael turned and motioned for her to sit at a small table in the center of the room. Elaine reluctantly followed, sitting down across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no sign of the charming, smooth-talking man she had come to know. This Michael was different, cold, distant, almost calculating. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he began, his voice low and steady, "but you need to know the truth." Elaine's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I never planned on falling for you, you know. I was using you. You were just a means to an end. But things have changed. You're in too deep now, Elaine. You can't walk away." Elaine's mind raced. She wanted to stand up, to leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael's expression softened for a moment, as though he was considering his next words carefully. "I've been planning this for a long time. The murder. Everything. It was never just about me getting away with it. I needed you to be a part of it. You're the one who has the power to change everything, to make sure the truth never comes out. And now you're too involved to turn back." Elaine's pulse quickened, her mind racing as she processed what he was saying. The murder, the case, everything that had drawn them together. It was all a part of his plan. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, and now she was trapped. She felt sick, betrayed, but also terrified. Michael had always been 2 steps ahead, and she had been too blind to see it. "You think you can control me?" she spat, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "You think you can manipulate me like everyone else?" Michael's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "You were never in control, Elaine. You think you've been making your own choices, but you haven't. Every step you've taken has been guided by me. I've been watching you, studying you, and now we're in this together. There's no way out." Elaine's heart dropped. She realized, in that moment, that she had been a fool. Everything, her attraction to him, her belief that she could save him, that she could change him, had been part of his strategy. He had played on her vulnerabilities, her desire for connection, and turned it into something far more sinister. She stood up abruptly, her mind spinning. "I won't be a part of this anymore," she said, her voice firm despite the fear churning inside her. "I won't help you." Michael didn't move. He simply watched her as if he had already anticipated her response. "You don't have a choice. You never did." The room seemed to grow colder, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. Elaine's hands trembled as she turned to leave, but before she could take a step, she heard the distinct sound of a door creaking open behind her. She spun around, but it was too late. Several men emerged from the shadows, blocking her escape. Michael's expression darkened as he watched her panic. "You see, Elaine," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "I didn't want it to end this way, but now you're mine, one way or another." Elaine's heart raced as she realized the full extent of her entrapment. Michael had always known that she would be his downfall, and now he was going to make sure that she would never escape. She had underestimated him, and now she had no way out. She could feel the walls closing in around her, and for the first time, she truly understood the danger she was in. In that moment, Elaine realized that everything she had ever known, her career, her identity, and her morals, had all been swept away by the power of a criminal who had always known how to play the game, and now it was too late to stop it. Elaine's world collapsed in on her. The men standing in front of her, their faces expressionless, made it clear that there was no way out. Michael had orchestrated everything with precision, and now she was nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. Every moment she had spent with him, every piece of her life she had offered him had been calculated, manipulated. The man she thought she understood, the man she thought she had loved, was nothing more than a predator, and she had been blind to it. As the reality of her situation sank in, Elaine's mind raced. She had always prided herself on her intelligence, her ability to remain composed under pressure, but now she felt like a fool. She had let her emotions cloud her judgment. She had let herself be swept away by his charm, his words. The fact that she had become so entangled in his web, both professionally and personally, was the biggest mistake of her life, and now she was facing the consequences. Michael's men slowly closed in on her, their steps deliberate, their presence suffocating. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow as panic began to set in. She knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let herself become another victim in his path. But as she looked at Michael, standing there with that cold, calculating expression, she realized that any attempt to fight back would be futile. He had already won. "Me," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she tried to make sense of it all. Michael's gaze softened for a brief moment, but it was fleeting. "It was never about you, Elaine," he replied, his tone almost regretful. "You were just part of the plan. I needed you, but you were never meant to survive it." Elaine felt a chill run down her spine as the words hit her. She had been nothing more than a tool, an instrument to further his plans. She had trusted him, allowed herself to be drawn into his world, and now it was too late. With a sudden, sharp movement, Michael gestured for his men to step forward. Elaine's body tensed, knowing what was coming. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Michael's face, a mask of indifference, as he turned away. The game was over. She had lost.